Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Abergan. This day, May 30th, 1979, a 6-year-old New Yorker by the name of Etan Patz disappeared. He lived in Manhattan in Soho, and that day his parents were letting him walk the 2 blocks to his bus stop to take the bus to school all by himself for the very first time. But as we know, as America would soon know, he never made it. Patz's family started a frantic search for him once they realized at the end of the day that he was missing. He never showed up at school. It quickly spread around New York City and then the country. His face would be on flyers, on milk cartons, all over TV. He was never found, but his case became one of the most notable in an era in which child abduction became a major concern. We've gotten a number of requests to do an episode about Etan Patz, and I'll just read from an email we got from Adam, who writes, and I'm quoting here, "This is truly one of those before and after moments. Before, there was a sense of safety. After, the kids were all on the side of milk cartons." So let's talk about the Etan Patz case and the rise of the stranger danger era. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hi there.
Do either of you remember seeing, not the Etan Patz case, but do you remember seeing kids on the side of milk cartons? Is that something that was part of your...
I have to say, we bought our milk in plastic jugs.
Okay.
So they didn't put the kids on the side of those. But it was this thing. There was this young adult novel that I had growing up that was something like The Girl on the Side of the Milk Carton or something like that. Except in that case, spoilers for a 30 or 40-year-old book, the girl saw herself on the side of the milk carton and realized she'd been abducted. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, that is a wild story.
It's a good twist. It's a good twist.
It's a good twist. But I mean, it speaks to how much of a trope or how common this had become that you could write an entire kids book around this because it was so everyone understood that like missing kids appeared on the side of milk cartons.
Yeah, I think I remember both. Definitely the plastic milk cartons were much more of my like formative years, but I do remember seeing people on the side of milk cartons. I remember also seeing like posters in the grocery store. You would see like sort of flyers up for "Have you seen this child?" Public places, you might see something like that. So I was definitely aware of it, and I certainly grew up in the stranger danger era where parents were a lot more helicopterish about how they handled their children.
This is also the era of like Robert Stack and Unsolved Mysteries, where kind of like the motivating force for some of those shows was we have to find these lost kids. And I think that fed into that sense of stranger danger too. Like true crime was being brought to you at least once a week on TV. And a lot of the times it had to do with kids who were abducted.
I think this also ties into like the end of the latchkey kid era because my older siblings definitely had a lot more free roaming than I did. You know, they could sort of walk to the corner store or walk to a friend's house or walk to the park. And it was never sort of, there was never sort of a reason to have alarm about that. And then I knew, you know, as I grew older that we had less and less of a leash about where we could go.
Yeah. And there's so much, you know, underlying that and that rise of the stranger danger era, and I want to get back to some of that stuff and some of the other details about the milk cartons and the pizza boxes and so forth. But Etan Patz, you know, 6-year-old kid, it's his parents are literally, this is the first day that they've decided, because it's Memorial Day, it's the Friday before Memorial Day, it's right towards the end of the school year, it's the first day that they've decided to let him walk 2 blocks to the bus stop where he's going to get picked up. And his mother described how, you know, I've been to that stretch, and I just watched some videos, and I know that you can see his door from where the bus stop is. His mother describes walking him down, seeing him walk on his way to the bus stop, seeing him, and then, you know, saying, okay, he's good, and then walking upstairs, and that's not until the end of the day that they realize he didn't come on the bus home. There's an interesting element here in that his father is a photographer and had tons and tons of photos, and if we're being honest, good photos that make him look like a cute kid, you know, and immediately plastered first the neighborhood and then New York City and then eventually, you know, mass media with these photos. But part of me wonders just if it weren't for that kind of like cache of really compelling photos of this kid, if this case would have taken off in the same way.
I think that compelling photo, I mean, just as there's this thing about like the missing white girl syndrome, right? Somebody who's like looks charismatic, and because she's white and because she's usually blonde and blue-eyed, people really respond to that. And I would imagine this little moppet who's like 6 years old and has all of these, I'm sure, incredibly charismatic photos of him. Kids those age photograph so beautifully, especially in a professional's hands. I think you're right that there's something about the image itself that probably led this to become a national story.
This reminds me, too, of like when we think about, this was later, 1996, I think, JonBenet Ramsey, who was a child model and pageant princess. And her pictures were everywhere. And part of that, I think, too, is that the fact that she had this pageant background, she had tons of images of her. And her face became the most recognizable face of a child in the 1990s. I swear it was everywhere.
And to kind of connect what Kellie was saying earlier about the switch from latchkey kids to helicopter parents, the story of Patz illustrates how much schools have changed as well, because Patz doesn't show up to school and his teacher notices that he's missing, but doesn't report it to the principal. There's not that big of a deal that's made of it. You know, nowadays it feels like there is an incessant amount of communication between schools and children and parents, and something like this, I think, likely would have gone reported pretty quickly, or somebody would have reached out. And in this case, nobody's particularly alarmed. And it doesn't seem like there's much of a system in place to raise an alarm in case somebody doesn't show up.
You know, this is interesting, too, because my kids are small, and there's a rule in I don't know if it's statewide, but if you are in kindergarten or younger, you cannot get off the bus if a parent is not at the bus stop. So one time I was late to the bus stop and they kept JoJo on the bus until I showed up. And if I didn't show up, they would take her back to school and then, you know, call an adult. But like, this happened to a lot of other parents I've talked to who've been just a couple minutes late. The bus driver won't release their children. And I think that is part of this precautious moment where, you know, the bus driver kind of knows everyone, kind of checks up for who shows up and who doesn't. There's a real sense of like surveillance within the community that I think people pay attention to much more now.
I mean, it's funny. I think I know and get that policy. You know, part of me also thinks that like that policy is probably most effective because it means that kids aren't walking around streets, maybe getting hit by cars. I mean, you know, so much of this story is about what is at a large systemic level, what are the real dangers for kids, right? And this created a panic around abduction, but you think about all the other things that are dangerous to kids in cities and communities and places where there isn't that. And I think underlying a big part of this in the 70s and into the 80s is a sort of changing both physical and social landscape where kids are a little more at risk even walking, you know, in their community.
In urban areas or rural areas, wherever there's not a large people presence. Because you would think in New York City that someone would see a child screaming or something. But that's what also makes this so terrifying is that, you know, after this alarm is sort of sounded and his picture goes out everywhere and there's all this coverage, there are not a lot of signs. There are not a lot of, you know, signals to his whereabouts.
I think that's part of what's so scary about it, right? There is an instant search that begins once the mom reports that her child did not return home. They send out 100 police officers. They send out bloodhounds. They're not just putting him on the side of milk cartons. They're projecting his image in Times Square. And there's just not a trace. There's not a lead anywhere. And like 22 years later, they finally declare him dead because they're like, we have no body, we have no leads, we have nothing. We have theories about what might have happened, but the idea that you could disappear in plain sight like that,
right?
I think as it feeds so many of the fears of white vans roaming around and strangers whispering to try to entice a child in a friendly way, right? Like this is the don't take candy from strangers era where you're like, because that's what keeps there from being a scene is if the child is just like enticed to come along and then it doesn't seem like anything is wrong and then the child can just disappear. And that seemed to have been what happened with Patz.
used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Let's conclude the story and then circle back to kind of the bigger stranger danger picture. So, yeah, the case is closed effectively on December. He's legally declared dead in June of 2001. And then quite recently, I mean, I was living here in New York, and I remember when this happened, but the case was reopened in May of 2010. And then in May of 2012, the NYPD announces that it has taken a man into custody who had implicated himself in the Patz disappearance. So what do we know about this man?
Yeah, he is a 51-year-old man named Pedro Hernandez of Maple Shade, New Jersey, and he basically confessed to strangling the child. And his brother-in-law basically called in a tip when he saw that the case was reopening and talked about how Hernandez was an 18-year-old convenience store worker working in the local bodega, and that he had confessed to killing the boy in the 1980s. Not just him, but others as well. And it's not until February 14th of 2017 that Hernandez is found guilty of kidnapping and felony murder and given a lifelong sentence in prison.
And you get the sense that had he not confessed repeatedly over the years and had somebody not turned him in after the case had been reopened, there just would have been, I mean, it's hard to say there's ever closure for something like this, but there never would have been a kind of end to this story.
Yeah. And I mean, police, I'm remembering the details of when this case got reopened, but police had searched that bodega because it was right there. It was just in that 2-block stretch on the way to school. All right. Coming back to the stranger danger, kind of rise of stranger danger. I mean, it is so interesting how much, and I think we're noticing this now, that culture just swings all the way from one end to all the way to the other. And I think if you are a kid who's born in 1977 or 74 or 75, you probably like simultaneously are a latchkey kid and a kid who's like under this shroud of stranger danger and don't say no and so forth. And it's just this like really fascinating stew of two extremes, right? Of like the completely checked out parent and then the completely worried and overwhelmed, but not actually maybe sort of productively helping you navigate the world parent.
I was definitely a latchkey kid growing up, and yet also somebody who knew the story of the kids on the milk carton, watched Unsolved Mysteries every time that it was on, feared white vans and people handing out candy. Like I lived in the stranger danger mindset of the 80s and 90s, but also there was a sense that it could happen, but, you know, we lived out in the country, and like the thing was you were supposed to be prepared, you were supposed to know, and you were supposed to defend yourself. And like, but this was like before helicopter parenting became quite as much of a thing. And maybe I just didn't have particularly overprotective parents, but I do think there was a while that those two things were, especially in the 90s, like this was all happening side by side, latchkey kids and this real fear of strangers.
You know, now I think a lot of the lessons that we have learned, or sort of the instruction that kids are given, is to, you know, if someone's approaching you, to scream, to yell, to call out, to kick, whatever, to sort of, you know, I've seen stories that they've always shown on the news where, you know, a little girl's almost abducted. She screams, she kicks, and strangers come to her aid, or, you know, her parent hears her and comes to her aid. But this is really, you know, frightening when you think about just like the process of abduction, how that happens in public, in daylight, in the morning, you know, in a city. I think it makes everybody feel a little bit vulnerable. And so it's hard to approach parenting because you want your kids to be independent. At the same time, the world can get ugly.
But it's also a really misleading story in a way, too, because the statistics that we have from like the 80s and 90s and beyond, whether it was not just the concerns about abduction, but also child sexual abuse, was always like, oh, beware the stranger. But of course, most of these cases, even cases of child abduction, involve somebody that knows the child, right? And it's actually not stranger danger. It's familiar danger.
Yeah,
or
it's a
family
parent.
danger
It could
in
be
a
a
lot of
parent
ways.
that's like kidnapping, involved in kidnapping, or a step parent or grandparent. It's not often always the stranger.
And and something feels particularly twisted or something about just the milk carton and the pizza carton, and then just the fact that like it's coming to you when you're like sitting there eating breakfast. In terms of the amount of fear and paranoia and panic that it creates, it's one thing to have a primetime TV show where you're showing this stuff, and there are cases of like these signs working and the milk cartons working occasionally too, but the idea that it would just be like the thing that is the story that is being told to you while you're eating your cereal or whatever.
Like a normalized fear is something that I think
exactly.
is really problematic. Like, it's not something that you sit down and talk to. It's about you're eating your lunch and you're how many times have you been eating like a box of cereal and you're looking at the box of cereal, or you're reading it, or you're looking at the milk carton? But
there's a choice there. It's like the most important message that we can send to you in this moment is the idea that you should be terrified, and that little kids who look just like you are getting snatched all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, that has an effect. And I think, just as we wrap up, I think we see, obviously, and I get it, but it's like we see how persistent fears about what's happening to my children are every single generation, and how easily sort of weaponized, and even if not, it's intentionally weaponized, how distorted they can quickly become, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's clearly going on in this post-pandemic era, where people are freaking out about what's going on in schools. It comes from the same place in many ways.
If there is a silver lining, I think about how technology has worked alongside children abductions. And so when you think about the Amber Alert system, which comes out in 1996, but now, we all get cell phone alerts. So I've gotten them on my phone, it'll say like Amber Alert, the description of the car, blue sedan, something like this.
But Kelly, how often, what does that do to you other than just make you scared?
Because I'm like, I'm in my house. What am I going to do?
Yeah, I'm like, fuck, that sucks.
Yeah.
And I feel bad. And then I move on. And sure, maybe I'll see a blue sedan or whatever. But, it's like the Citizen app, too. It's just kind of like, it's just there to ratchet up tension.
But,
all things need to be sort of in balance and in context, I guess.
In the Netherlands, the Amber Alert system has a 94% success rate. So clearly people are paying attention and they're calling stuff in when they see
in the
it.
Netherlands.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, yeah.
Right. And this is in the Netherlands. But no, I do think, and this is like such a deeper conversation, and this is not really my territory, but in the amount that I've thought about this, I would say that's probably more reflective of other things in the social fabric in a country than, the effectiveness of an Amber Alert, right? And so there are places in the world, and I think the U.S. tends not to be one of them, where, communities are sort of more bonded and people know kids' names and they look out for each other, and there's density and there's like a calmness to the streets and all those things that sort of maybe contribute so that when an Amber Alert goes out, it actually has effectiveness. But here we're like, we're so isolated. I just think that more than anything just causes a bit of a panic or just an ambient stress that isn't in the end very helpful. But what do I know?
Maybe in the Netherlands they rely on community. I think here in the United States we rely on the panopticon. Kelly, you mentioned technology, but it's like your Ring doorbell and the fact that your kid probably has like an air tag on them or all of these things, right? Like that the bodega would have 30 cameras focused on it at any one moment.
Yes.
I think has it just means that the stranger danger comes in a different package, and we rely on different tools for, if not keeping us safe, then cracking the mystery.
That's true. The hyper surveillance. Man, those Ring cameras. Blessing and a curse. It's a lot.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad we got to the case of Etan Patz, and there's certainly lots of interesting things to talk about here. But thank you to Adam and all the other listeners who suggested we do it. And thanks to you, Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.